Hi everyone, we're going to do a quick run through of the basal ganglia in the brain, and we're going to be doing so by going through these both coronal and later axial or horizontal slices. And first off, I want to thank the Functional Neuroanatomy website, neuroanatomy.ca. Go ahead and check them out. It turns out that there is at least one thing Canadians do better than maple syrup, and it's neuroscience. So we're going to start here looking for the basal ganglia. We're very far anterior, rostral out here in the brain. So we're going to start rolling back, and as soon as we start seeing the corpus callosum, we're going to get ready to see structures of the basal ganglia. Go a little bit further, we have the opening of our lateral ventricle, and then here we have our basal ganglia coming into play. Now the first member we see here is in the wall of the lateral ventricle itself. This is the caudate nucleus, and here, a bit inferiorly and slightly separated by it by some white matter, we'll see that better in a moment, is the putamen. Now the putamen and the caudate nucleus are somewhat visibly fused down here by what's called the nucleus accumbens. So nucleus accumbens down here inferiorly. We're going to go another step further posteriorly, although I did too many. And here, once again, we can see the caudate nucleus bulging out into the wall of the lateral ventricle, putamen here, and fused inferiorly at the nucleus accumbens. Moving on to section 8, we can now see a little bit more clearly the separation between the big head of the caudate nucleus here and the putamen. This is the anterior limb of the internal capsule. This is white matter transitioning between the cortex and more inferior structures. And again, down here, we still have a little bit of that nucleus accumbens hanging on. But as we go a bit further posteriorly, that's going to become less and less pronounced, and the white matter separation of the internal capsule will become more pronounced. At this point, we have a clear separation between the caudate nucleus and the putamen here. We've got that anterior limb of the internal capsule, but we're also picking up now what's known as the globus pallidus, this somewhat triangular shaped structure just here. I'm going to turn the labels on real quick so you can see how they've pointed that out. The globus pallidus is here, the putamen is just lateral to it, and they're both separated from the caudate nucleus by the anterior limb of the internal capsule. Now I want to mention that the caudate nucleus has a really big head, but it dwindles very much as it goes posteriorly. So the body and tail of the caudate nucleus are still associated with the lateral ventricle, but they're much smaller. I'm going to jump a little further posteriorly, and here we're starting to see that the globus pallidus actually has two subdivisions. We actually have a pars externa, and this little dot right here is the pars interna. Functionally, they're very distinct. We're going to see those differences when we talk about the pathways through the basal ganglia. But once again, we have the caudate nucleus, anterior limb of the internal capsule, putamen, and then the globus pallidus, pars externa and interna. Now at this point, it's worth mentioning that the terminology can be a little bit rough because neuroscientists like to group the globus pallidus and putamen together and call it the lenticular nucleus. And functionally, the caudate nucleus and the putamen are very similar and have very similar functions, and so they're often called the striatum. So just remember, striatum equals caudate nucleus plus putamen, lenticular nucleus equals putamen plus globus pallidus. All right, we'll keep going a little further posteriorly. We can see here putamen and a nice clean separation between the globus pallidus pars externa, globus pallidus pars interna, and up here, once again, caudate nucleus getting smaller as we go more posteriorly. And we're starting to actually catch some of our brainstem here. We're not quite out of the thalamus yet, but we'll be getting to the midbrain shortly. So we go a little further back. Once again, let's run through them all. Caudate nucleus here, internal capsule, putamen, globus pallidus. But here, we're starting to get these splotchy collections of gray matter. This is actually thalamic nuclei. We're far enough posteriorly that we're going into the thalamus. And we're just about to pass out of the hypothalamus into the midbrain inferiorly. Go a little further, and true enough, we see black stuff. In Latin, black stuff is substantia nigra. So this is part of the midbrain. And the substantia nigra has a pars compacta and a pars articularis. We don't have to identify those, but just know that they are involved. with signaling for motor activity and are part of the basal ganglia. Just superior and lateral to the substantia nigra, we have our subthalamic nucleus, another structure involved in the basal ganglia and their circuitry. Here's the red nucleus. It's a nice landmark, not part of the basal ganglia per se, although the basal ganglia can have some impact on its function. And up here we have our nice big thalamic nuclei. Note that the putamen and globus pallidus are getting less and less distinct, and the caudate nucleus keeps on getting smaller and smaller. So we're going to go a little further posterior. We're losing all of those other structures now, except for the caudate nucleus, which we can see just hanging on inside the ventricle, but it's getting smaller and smaller as we go posteriorly. So that's about all we can see on the coronal view. Let's switch over now to the horizontal brain slices. We're starting superiorly, and we're going to progressively go inferiorly and see these structures again. So we start out and we go a little bit deeper, and until we get to the corpus callosum, there's really not much that we can expect to see. But right here, we're catching the corpus callosum, bridging the left and right hemispheres. Go a bit further inferiorly, still no basal ganglia. But, let me back up just a second. If you notice this huge bulge in the lateral wall of the lateral ventricle, that's the surface projection of the caudate nucleus with its great big head and dwindling body and tail. So now we can actually see the head of the caudate nucleus right there, internal capsule separating it from other structures, but we're still fairly superior. So let's go a little bit further inferiorly and see these structures. And here's a nice view of the caudate nucleus bulging out into the lateral ventricle's wall there. The anterior limb of the internal capsule here in white. Then we have the genu of the internal capsule, the bend, and the posterior limb of the internal capsule. So the anterior limb of the internal capsule separates the caudate nucleus from the putamen out here, and the posterior limb separates the putamen from the thalamus and the thalamic nuclei just there. Go a bit further inferior, and it looks about the same. You can see a nice clean internal capsule there. Go a bit further, and we'll start to hopefully see the globus pallidus coming in. It's not super distinct right here, but we've got the putamen right here, and this inner triangle is the globus pallidus. We can't quite make out the pars externa and the pars interna, but they are present, just not as obvious as we might like. We've gone a little further down now, and we've lost those, but we've picked up our substantia nigra. Thankfully, easy to spot because it literally is full of black stuff, which is going to be noting the neurons that are producing dopamine within the midbrain. And we got a little bit more of it here going inferiorly, but we'll soon run out of the midbrain altogether and get into the pons. And at that point, we've lost any real connection with the basal ganglia, and we will call it quits right there. Thank you very much.